Imagining Society Beyond Capital by Peter Hudis. Few problems weigh more heavily upon humanity today than developing a viable alternative to capitalism. The increasing levels of income inequality worldwide, coupled with massive destruction of the environment and increasing social alienation, are threatening to undermine the very basis of human and natural existence, as capitalism reverts to ever more aggressive forms of intolerance and social control, as seen in the reaction of numerous European powers to the influx of millions of refugees from Africa and the Middle East, and the rising threat posed by nativist and racist currents in the United States body politic. The need for an alternative vision that can give direction to the aspirations of those dissatisfied with the existing state of affairs is especially palpable. Nevertheless, meeting this challenge is far from easy, not least because radical theorists and activists tend to draw their poetry from the past, even when it no longer serves much of a purpose. For many decades, innumerable figures on the left have argued that it is utopian and even futile to delineate the specific form and features of a post-capitalist society, since historical materialism commands us to engage in a critique of the existing conditions from which it can imminently emerge. But the argument is inherently self-refuting for two reasons. First, if the analysis of present-day conditions is of such overriding importance, why act as if we are still living in the mid-19th century when Marxism took shape as a reaction against utopianism? Why repeat the truths of a different era instead of grappling with those of our own? Is it really so self-evident that traditional objections to envisioning a new society retain their validity in the 21st century, after almost 100 years of aborted revolutions, Stalinism, and failed efforts at socialist transformations? And do not today's material conditions suggest that one of the greatest barriers standing in the way of effective anti-capitalist action is a crisis in imagining an alternative to a society dominated by the all-pervasive power of capital? Second, if the central task of Marxist theory is defined as critically analyzing existing realities, why presume that a comprehensive discussion of a possible post-capitalist future is out of order? Is it not possible to articulate future forms of life that are embedded, however implicitly, in the terrain of the present? If one wishes to argue that the future is imminent within the existing material conditions, one must be logically consistent enough to acknowledge the need to articulate what the future is. To the extent that dialectical thought delineates normative values from objective realities, the critical analysis of the latter cannot help but compel the conceptualization of the former in some way. The fundamental problem we face today is that the alternative to the state of affairs that goes by the name of capitalism is very far from clear, perhaps less clear than ever. At one time, it may have been possible to claim that the abolition of private property and the free market would free humanity from the incubus of capitalism, racism, sexism, and class domination. Yet today, this is no longer possible, given how the logic of capital proliferated in societies that abolished private ownership of the means of production and an unregulated market. Capitalism has proved to be far more resilient than many of its radical critics anticipated, in large measure because the alternative that was supposed to replace it proved so threadbare when it came to delivering on the promise of liberation. Given the realities of our life and times, we clearly need to think out a more adequate conception of an alternative to capitalism than has hitherto been available. To meet this challenge, we will need to marshal many theoretical and conceptual resources. I wish to argue that we need begin with Marx, precisely because his work constitutes the foremost and irreplaceable critique of the capitalist mode of production. Since Marx's body of work is dialectical, insofar as it views every social formation and development from the perspective of its tendencies towards transformation and dissolution, as much to tell us about what constitutes a post-capitalist society. That Marx refrained from writing blueprints about the future and disparaged utopian speculation that was not grounded in a careful analysis of actually existing social realities does not mean that he lacked a distinctive conception of socialism and communism. Nor is it the case that it was only in the 20th century that the true nature of socialist or communist society became clarified by followers of Marx such as Kautsky, Lenin, Preobrazhensky, Mao et al. As I show in Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism, Hudis 2012, Marx's body of thought contains vitally important discussions of the nature of a post-capitalist society that have been overlooked by his critics as well as his followers. Now that we have his complete works, the Gesamtausgabe, before us, it becomes possible to reconstruct, from both his published and unpublished work, an overall outline of his concept of a post-capitalist society with an eye to how it addresses today's search for pathways to surmount capitalist value production. 2 points concerning dialectical methodology need to guide our investigation from the outset. It only becomes possible to develop a genuine alternative to capitalism if we first grasp what does not constitute an alternative. As Spinoza long ago remarked, all determination is negation. Thinkers from an array of traditions, both friendly and hostile to Marx, have presumed that the abolition of private property and unregulated commodity, labor, and financial markets represent the point of divide between capitalism and socialism. This chapter will show that such a position has no basis either in Marx's text or in actual social realities. In fact, much of what called itself socialism or communism over the past 100 years owes little or nothing to Marx's understanding of the transcendence of capitalism. 2. Although Marx developed a distinct conception of a socialist communist alternative, is not grounded in a priori assumptions regarding the nature of the good life or in an ideal type to which history ought to conform. Like Hegel, Marx holds that the object generates its own categories of knowledge. Marx studiously adhered to the Hegelian notion that logic has nothing to do with thought about something, which stands outside by itself as the base of thought. The determinations are not just of the knowing subject, but are rather determinations of the object, end quote. Hegel. In carrying through this perspective into a critical analysis of his object of investigation, capital, Marx discloses a form of domination that shackles human creativity while at the same time containing imminent possibilities for its transcendence. That Marx spent most of his life delineating the logic of capital should not be seen as a substitute for elucidating a concept of communism, but rather as the necessary path for doing so. A further historical point grounds our analysis. Marx used many phrases to refer to a post-capitalist society. Communism, socialism, positive humanism, communal production, realm of free individuality, free association, etc. Free association! That's where my name comes from, so of the YouTube channel at least. It's not my name in real life. Well, it's on my birth certificate, but that's not what people call me. And my grandparents call me free association. These terms are completely interchangeable in his work. The notion that socialism and communism are distinct forms of society or phases of historical development is alien to Marx's work and only entered the lexicon of Marxism after his death. I will here demonstrate these claims by looking briefly at 4 moments in Marx's work: his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, the Grundrisse, Capital, and his 1875 critique of the Gotha program. Marx's effort to envision an alternative to capitalism was grounded in a specific concept of humanity's social being. In his early writings, he argues that freedom is not something that merely ought to exist, but is rather an ontological characteristic of the human being. He writes, quote, "No man combats freedom. At most, man combats the freedom of others," end quote. Man's conception that we find freedom in our social being rather than from our social being elaborated shortly afterward in his concept of humanity's, quote, species being, became his standard for critically evaluating political and economic realities. By measuring social reality against the potential disclosed by our species being, Marx establishes the normative criteria for critically judging the most mystifying aspects of capitalism while discerning the necessity for a form of life that can transcend it. At the same time, Marx developed a distinctive understanding of what constitutes a viable alternative to capitalism through his indebtedness to Hegel's dialectic of negativity. The basic idea of communism, an equitable distribution of the product through the abolition of private property, long predates Marx. For Marx, however, abolishing private property is a necessary but insufficient condition for liberation. This is because it leaves untouched the alienation in the very activity of laboring. Marx develops this in his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 by making use of Hegel's insight that since all negation is dependent on the object of critique, the transcendence of alienation proceeds from, quote, the negation of the negation, end quote. Marx writes that, quote, vulgar communist infatuation with abolishing private property is only a first, quote, abstract negation that shares with capitalism an infatuation with having instead of being. It is only a retrogression, a sham, a universality, I'm reading too fast. Marx writes that the vulgar communist, Lord give me strength. Marx writes that the vulgar communist infatuation with abolishing private property is only a first abstract negation that shares with capitalism an infatuation with having instead of being. It is only a retrogression, a sham universality. It does not by itself lead to what Marx calls, quote, positive humanism, being from itself, end quote. Significantly, Marx does not demonstrate this by simply noting that class relations can remain unaltered even when property forms are significantly transformed, a point that is surely implied by his analysis. Marx goes further by calling attention to the impact of the, quote, vulgar communist infatuation with collective property on gender relations. The effort to define emancipation by the replacement of private ownership with collective ownership, he writes, quote, finds expression in the brutish form of opposing to marriage, certainly a form of exclusive private property, the community of women, in which a woman becomes a piece of communal and common property, end quote. Indeed, quote, it may be said that this idea of the community of women gives away the secret of this as yet completely crude and thoughtless communism, end quote. The treatment of women as an object of communal possession is hardly an advance upon traditional marriage, since, quote, greed reestablishes itself and satisfies itself only in another way, end quote. This proves for Marx the fundamental defect of the vulgar communist infatuation with property forms, since, quote, the direct, natural, and necessary relation of person to person is the relation of man to woman. In this relationship, therefore, is sensuously manifested, reduced to an observable fact, the extent to which the human essence has become nature to man, or which nature to man has become the human essence of man, end quote. Relations between the sexes serve as the measure, Marx argues, for the validity, or lack thereof, of any critical stance assumed by those taking issue with existing society. Therefore, quote, in the approach to woman as the spoil and handmaid of communal lust is expressed the infinite degradation in which man exists for himself." End quote. It may seem that issues of gender have little to do with the central object of investigation in the 1844 manuscripts, the nature of labor in class society. However, Marx opposes class society because a product of human activity, society itself, with society's accompanying social division of labor, takes on a life of its own and confronts the individual subject as a person apart that imposes its will irrespective of his and her actual needs and desires. This inversion of subject and object, which Marx sees as also expressed in Hegel's idealistic mystification of the state as the subject rather than the predicate of human activity, is a critical normative principle employed in his analysis of capitalism. Marx opposes any formation in which individuals become dominated and constrained by social relations and products of their own making. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels write that with the division of labor, in which human activity is not freely but naturally divided, quote, man's own act becomes opposed to him as an alien power over and above him, which subjugates man instead of being controlled by him, end quote. And the first historical expression of this social division of labor, Marx and Engels contend, quote, is the family, where the wife and children are slaves of the husband, end quote. Marx therefore objects to, quote, vulgar communism, because its infatuation with replacing private with collective property leaves unchanged the alienated and inverted character of man-woman relations that characterize all forms of class society. Any form of social change, even one that goes by the name of, quote, communist, that does not transform the most fundamental of human relationships, remains untenable. The object of Marx's critique, therefore, goes much deeper than property forms. As he writes in 1844, quote, "For when one speaks of private property, one thinks of dealing with something external to man. When one speaks of labor, one is directly dealing with man himself. This new formulation of the question already contains its solution," end quote. Here we see Marx's thoroughgoing humanism, focusing on altering forms of property, that is, on a product of labor, does not get to the critical issue, since it still deals with something, quote, external to man, while leaving untouched that which is interior to it, the human relations at the point of production and between the sexes. By shifting the object of critique from property forms to the deeper level of production relations, Marx is able to touch the nerve of human relations, and those that not only concern class, but gender as well. This new, quote, new formulation of the question already contains its solution, end quote, insofar as the alternative to the existing state of affairs is now posited as new human relations that are no longer characterized by subject-object inversion. Oh, that's deep one. If I was reading by myself, and not to my listeners, I'd read that again. Marx therefore concludes that to reach a truly free society, the focus on negating private property must itself be negated by achieving a thoroughgoing transformation of the social relations of production. On these grounds, he contends in 1844, that genuine, quote, communism is the position as the negation of the negation, end quote. In his writing of 1844 to 1846, Marx's analysis calls into question all relations, quote, in which the human being objectifies itself inhumanly in opposition to himself, end quote. The focus in his subsequent work on the need to uproot the class relations of existing society is part and parcel of envisioning a transformation of human relations. This is a far cry from the conventional fixation on property forms and market relations that characterize many radical tendencies both in his time and long afterwards. Moreover, quote, private property does not simply refer to private or individual ownership of the means of production. For Marx, private property denotes the ownership of the means of production by a minority at the expense of the, quote, vast majority. The Communist Manifesto refers to this as, quote, class property of the bourgeoisie. Footnote. A quotation from Marx and Engels, I assume from the Communist Manifesto. Let's read and find out. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the systems of producing and appropriating products. That is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. End of footnote. In contrast, far too many have assumed that it is sufficient to abolish individual ownership and transfer control of the means of production to the state. But what happens if the state is not democratic and if the workers and peasants are not in actual control of the means of production? Property forms are juridical relations, whereas the fundamental issue for any Marxist is production relations. If a bureaucratic clique controls the production relations, it is hard to see how collective ownership of the means of production, in the Marxian sense, can be said to exist. On these grounds, Marx often takes issue in his work with statist socialists who assume that the transfer of ownership titles from private individuals to some sort of undifferentiated, quote, collective entity constitutes socialism. Marx's concept of a post-capitalist society is therefore derived not only from a detailed criticism of capitalist social relations, but also from a critique of left-wing tendencies that adopted variants of, quote, socialism and, quote, communism at odds with his own. This is also evident from Marx's criticism of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. I love saying Proudhon. Just feels so good coming out of my mouth. This is also evident from his criticism of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's effort to, quote, transform capitalism by promoting an equitable distribution of the social property by, quote, organizing exchange and introducing an equality of wages. Marx contends that this not only fails to address the problem of alienated labor, it also seeks to define the new society by universalizing the principle of wage labor that adheres to the old one. Proudhon fails to see, Marx contends, that calling for labor to be accorded equal monetary value fails to break with capitalism's drive to reduce laboring activity to an undifferentiated equivalent, quote, abstract labor. Hence, quote, Proudhon only transforms the relations of the present-day worker to his labor into the relationship of all men to labor. Society is then conceived as an abstract capitalist, end quote, Marx. Marx develops this further in his mature critique of political economy. He shows that the aim of capitalism is not to generate material wealth or satisfy use values. It is to augment exchange value. Use values are finite magnitudes. One can only use so many shoes, clothes, or foodstuffs. Exchange value, however, is a potentially infinite magnitude. This is because exchange value is the phenomenal manifestation of value. The value of a commodity is based not on the actual amount of time that it takes to produce the commodity, but on the average amount of time that is socially necessary to produce that commodity. A worker may spend 10 hours making a product, but that does not mean she has engaged in 10 hours of value-creating labor. If the average amount of time that is necessary on the world market to create that product is only 6 hours, the extra 4 hours of labor performed by the worker creates no value. As a result, the worker is constantly pressured to produce in accordance with an ever-shifting social average, socially necessary labor time. The worker is not in control of time. Time instead confronts the worker as a person apart, in quotes, subjects her to time's will. As the Marxist humanist philosopher, I always say her fucking name wrong, Raya Dunayevskaya put it, socially necessary labor time is the handmaiden of the machine that accomplishes the fantastic transformation of all concrete labors into one abstract mass. Constant technological revolutions change how much labor time is socially necessary. All must subordinate themselves to the newly set socially necessary time to be expended on commodities. End quote. Raya Dunayevskaya. This means that actual concrete labor is not the source of value in capitalism. The source of value is instead abstract labor, a specific form of labor that is governed by a social average that is indifferent to the sensuous needs and character of the laborer. The split between concrete and abstract, undifferentiated or homogeneous labor defines capitalism and has an egregious impact on all facets of human and natural existence. Remarkably, many commentators on Marx continue to overlook his cardinal distinction between value and exchange value, as well as his understanding of the dual character of labor, even though man considered Remarkably, many commentators on Marx continue to overlook his cardinal distinction between value and exchange value, as well as his understanding of the dual character of labor, even though Marx considered the dual character of labor, quote, his unique contribution, end quote, to the critique of political economy. Elizabeth Groves, for instance, writes, quote, the specificity of labor becomes homogenized into a system in which the commodity produced by that labor gains its value outside of itself, by being made equal to something else, its exchange value, through the mirroring of labor in the form of body of the commodity, though its embodiment as use value, which is then homogenized through exchange value. Differences in labor are ordered into a system of hierarchical structure, end quote. On the contrary, or Elizabeth Groves, on the contrary, Marx holds that labor becomes homogenized prior to the exchange of the commodity, insofar as it is subject to the discipline of socially necessary labor time in the very process of production. That homogenization is what makes generalized commodity exchange possible. Concrete and abstract labor are not two distinct moments of labor. One when the product is produced and the other when the product is exchanged, but occur simultaneously when confronted with the, quote, hierarchy of socially necessary labor time. To claim otherwise leads one to presume that organizing exchange in lieu of transforming production relations can uproot capitalism. Does the pressure to conform to an ever-changing abstract average ever end? Is there any finite limit to the drive to obey the dictates of value production? Surely not, since what dominates humanity is an abstract average that by definition escapes finite limits. From capital's standpoint, there is never enough value extracted from workers. No sooner is a given amount of value created in making a product than the socially necessary labor time further declines, which devalues part of what was earlier counted as the value of the product. Workers must produce more in less time to keep up with the level of value production in the previous cycle. This process is never ending. Value production, by its very nature, is an endless quest for an infinite magnitude. It goes without saying that natural resources are a finite magnitude, but ignore all of that, says capital, since we cannot produce more in a shorter amount of time without exploiting more natural resources. That is just the price that has to be paid for economic progress. The result is that the natural environment is considered a mere, quote, externality that is not factored into the cost of production. This process of exploiting and raping nature is as relentless as the drive to augment value itself. Capitalism, therefore, is based on a specific modality of time, abstract universal labor time, that confronts the body of associated producers as a person apart. It is the first, and for Marx, the last abstract form of social domination in which time ceases to be grounded in contingent conditions and circumstances, but rather assumes a fixed, objectified form that is indifferent to the sensuous needs of individuals. This issue of time brings us to the heart of Marx's critique of capital and how he understands its transcendence. Being alienated from the product of labor and being dominated by it in turn is bad enough, but time possesses an interiority that grounds and thereby makes possible any fashioning of an external spatial object. Time, as Kant shows in his first critique, is, quote, the immediate condition of the inner intuition of our souls, and thereby also the immediate condition of outer appearances, end quote. Kant in his first critique. Moreover, quote, no object can ever be given to us in experience that would not belong under the condition of time, end quote. Kant. Time, lived time, with all its flux and variation, is that which is most interior to our subjective experience. It is constitutive of our very being in the world. As Karol Kosick put it, quote, man knows his mortality only because he ignores time. Jesus Christ. I made it wrong. I said it wrong. As Karol Kosick put it, quote, man knows his mortality only because he organizes time on the basis of labor as objective doing and as the process of forming socio-human reality. Without this objective doing in which man organizes time into a future, a present, and a past, man could not know his totality. In capitalism, however, we become alienated from our... Oh, that's the end of the quote, Karol Kosick. In capitalism, however, we become alienated from our subjective experience of time insofar as it takes on a fixed, frozen, objectified form. Time now confronts the individual as an abstract, impermeable, objective power that bends the activity of laboring to its determinateness. Humanity no longer organizes time, as in pre-capitalist societies. Time now organizes humanity. As a result, we no longer know the world as being a result of our own subjective activity. The social totality becomes mystified. Human relations take on the form of relations between things, and things seem to take on a life of their own, as if awoken from the dead. We become alienated from that which grounds our very experience of the world. Herein lies the inner core of Marx's critique of capitalism. It is a critique of capitalist value production that goes much deeper than a mere opposition to private property and, quote, market anarchy. Though he surely opposes both private property and market anarchy. In Capitalism, Marx writes, quote, "We should not say that one man's hour is worth another man's hour, but rather that one man during an hour is worth just as much as another man during the same hour. Time is everything, man is nothing. Man is at most time's carcass," end quote. Marx. By identifying the central contradiction of capitalism in his critique of political economy, Marx is led to spell out a distinctive conception of post-capitalist society, one that is markedly different from the, quote, socialist and, quote, communist alternatives developed both in his time and by those who claim to govern in his name afterward. Since Marx locates the central problem of capitalism as consisting in the fact that, quote, individuals are subsumed under social production, which exist outside of them as their fate, end quote. A new society represents the inversion of this inversion by, quote, subsuming social production under the individuals who management as their common wealth, end quote. Marx. Marx spells this out in a remarkable passage in the Grundrisse, where he states that in socialism or communism, quote, the general character of labor would not be given to it only by exchange, end quote, since, quote, the communal character of production would from the outset make the product into a communal general one. The exchange initially occurring in production, which would not be an exchange of exchange values, but of activities determined by communal needs and communal purposes, would include from the beginning the individual's participation in the communal world of products. End quote. Marx, from the Grundrisse. Value production, which for Marx is specific to capitalism and capitalism alone, renders human relations indirectly social, since people are connected to each other through abstract forms of domination, such as money. In contrast, in socialism or communism, labor takes on a, quote, general character prior to the exchange of products on the basis of the, quote, communal character of production itself, end quote. This occurs through the free, democratic deliberation of the producers who control the means of production, not nominally, but actually. Once this occurs, generalized commodity production comes to an end. In other words, exchange value, which is the phenomenal expression of value production based on abstract labor, is eliminated as soon as new, freely associated, non-alienated conditions of labor come into existence. Freely associated individuals distribute the elements of production, including the amount of time that they do or do not invest in their social reproduction, through a plan based on their needs instead of being governed by forms that operate independently of them, such as the state or the market. In a post-capitalist society, labor becomes directly social, since the decisions and actions of the human being, not an autonomous force that exists outside the human being, such as exchange value, mediates their interaction. Marx refers to this in the Grundrisse as, quote, the realm of free individuality, end quote. This leap into the realm of freedom is made possible by capital itself, which generates a multiplicity of new needs by developing the productive forces on an unprecedented scale. It goes without saying that these new needs arise in an alienated form and context. Some of these needs may even be dangerous or superfluous. But once the value integument is stripped away, it becomes possible to release the forms of the new society that are immanently contained in the old one. And among the most important of these is the multiplicity of needs themselves. Marx does not envision a new society as a regression to the, quote, natural simplicity of pre-capitalist life, but let alone one of material impoverishment. Marx envisions a new society as making possible, quote, a totality of Jesus Christ. Everyone's loud in my fucking neighborhood. I'm gonna mow them all down with a machine gun, I swear to Christ. Just kidding. That's not my nature, I promise. Free association does not mow down people with machine guns. Where the fuck am I? It goes without saying that these new needs arise in an alienated form and context. Some of these needs may even be dangerous or superfluous. But once the forms of the new society that are immanently contained in the old one, But once the value integument is stripped away, it becomes possible to release the forms of the new society that are immanently contained in the old one. And among the most important of these is the multiplicity of needs themselves. Marx does not envision a new society as a regression to the, quote, natural simplicity of pre-capitalist life, let alone one of material impoverishment. He envisions a new society as making possible, quote, a totality of human manifestations of life, end quote. Value production creates the material conditions for this spiritual possibility, even as it constrains its actualization. The object generates its own categories of knowledge. In this case, the very knowledge of a post-capitalist society that surmounts the horizon. The object generates its own categories of knowledge, in this case, the very knowledge of a post-capitalist society that surmounts the horizon of value production. Marx further delineates this in Volume 1 of Capital, in, quote, the fetishism of commodities and its secret, which is Section 4 of Chapter 1. The fetishism of commodities is dispelled neither by the discovery of labor as the source of value, nor the proletariat as the revolutionary class. This is because, quote, the social relations between the producers, end quote, private laborers, appear as what they are, i.e., they do not appear as directed social relations between persons and their work, but as material relations between persons and social relations between things, end quote. Marx writes that since commodity fetishism is, quote, adequate to the concept of capital, its mysteriousness can be dissolved only by examining the present from the vantage point of, quote, other forms of production, end quote. Marx then writes, quote, let us finally imagine, for a change, an association of free men, working with the means of production held in common, end quote. In this future post-capitalist society, products are, quote, directly objects of utility, end quote, and do not assume a value form. Laborers decide how to produce, distribute, and consume the total social product. One part of the social product is used to renew the means of production. The other part is, quote, consumed by members of the association as means of subsistence, end quote. Marx invokes neither the market nor the state as the instrument through which this distribution of the elements of production is achieved. Instead, there is a freely planned distribution of labor time by those who are no longer subjected to socially necessary labor time. Although Marx speaks of a parallel with commodity production in that, quote, the share of each producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time, end quote, Marx is not suggesting that socialism or communism is governed by socially necessary labor time. There's a vast difference between socially necessary labor time and actual labor time. Socially necessary labor time imposes itself as a person apart, irrespective of the sensuous needs of individuals, whereas actual labor time is the sensuous activity of individuals mediating their relations with nature. There is a parallel with commodity production only in the sense of an exchange of equivalents, in that one contributes a given hour of labor to the community and receives from it goods and services produced in that same amount of time, a given hour of labor. But since there is no social average that governs the exchange, commodity production as such comes to an end. Footnote: the distinction between actual labor time and socially necessary labor time is of cardinal importance, since conflating the two leads to the erroneous conclusion that Marx posits value production as continuing to operate in a post-capitalist society. Georg Lukács made this erroneous conflation in his Ontology of Social Being and the Process of Democratization. Lukács writes, quote, for Marx, labor exploitation can exist under socialism if labor time is expropriated from the labor, since, quote, the share of every producer to the means of production is determined by his labor time, end quote. For Marx, the law of value is not dependent upon commodity production. According to Marx, these classical categories are applicable to any mode of production. End of footnote. Jesus Christ, that's like a pretty serious misunderstanding. It's Lukács. Only a couple of pages left, folks. Don't give up on me now. Marx further specifies this conception of a post-capitalist society in his 1875 Critique of the Gotha Program. The critique introduces, for the first time in his work, a distinction between a lower and higher phase of communism. Of the lower phase, Marx writes, quote, we are dealing here with a communist society, not as communist society has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, end quote. At this initial phase, quote, the producers do not exchange their products, just as little does the labor employed on the product appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labor, end quote. Generalized commodity exchange is possible only if there is a commensurate... General commodity exchange is possible only if there is a commensurate social substance, abstract labor, that enables the diverse array of products of labor to be universally exchanged. But with common ownership of the means of production, abstract or alienated labor comes to an end. Since abstract labor is the substance of value, value production also comes to an end even at this initial phase of socialism. Marx is pointing to a radical breach between capitalism and even the most defective or initial phase of the new society. Socialism or communism does not represent for Marx a more equitable distribution of value. It represents the abolition of value production itself from its initial moment of emergence. This is still only an initial phase, however, since an exchange of equivalents continues to prevail, albeit in a radically changed form. Quote, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it. What he has given to it is his individual quantum of labor. End quote, Marx. Individuals receive from society a voucher or token that they, quote, have furnished such and such an amount of labor after deducing his labor from the common funds, end quote, and through it obtain from, quote, the social stock of means of consumption as much as the amount of labor costs, end quote. This recapitulates what he had earlier said about the new society and capital. Marx is again not suggesting that the workers' labor is computed on the basis of a social average of labor time. Here, labor time simply refers to the amount of actual hours of work performed by the individual in a given community. Nevertheless, the form of remuneration in the lower phase is defective, since it is based on a quid pro quo. The individual receives from the community what he puts into the community, in the form of actual hours of labor time. Exchange value is abolished, but exchange based on, quote, equal standard, actual amounts of labor time persists. This equal standard or right, Marx acknowledges, is still in principle bourgeois right. That is because, quote, the right of the producers is proportional to the labor the producers supply, end quote. Since some may work longer hours than others, there will be inequities in the amount of remuneration they receive. The application of an equal standard, remuneration according to actual labor time, produces unequal results. Classes cease to exist, but not social differentiation based on levels of remuneration. This is unfortunate but inevitable, since, quote, right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development which this determines, end quote. In contrast, when we reach a higher phase of communism, a completely different principle prevails. Quote, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. No longer is remuneration based on the amount of labor time contributed by the individual. Actual labor time ceases to be a measure of social relations. No, quote, equal standard of any sort applies to a higher phase. The realm of bourgeois right and natural necessity is therefore left behind. The producers simply withdraw from the common storehouse what they need, and they give to society what they can, based on their natural and acquired abilities. This involves no quid pro quo, but this can only emerge once we have fully rid ourselves of the birthmarks of the old society. Marx's conception of the phases of communism should not be confused with the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, which he defines as a political transitional stage between capitalism and communism. As Marx clearly states in the critique, quote, between capitalist and communist society lies the period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat represents the democratic control of society by the, quote, immense majority, the producers, who use political power as a lever to eliminate class domination by revolutionizing the social relations of production. Engels spells out the thoroughly democratic character of this political transition stage in his critique of the 1891 Erfurt program. Quote, if one thing is certain, it is that our party, Engels spells out the thoroughly democratic character of this political transition stage in his critique of the 1891 Erfurt program. Quote, if one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. This is the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. End quote. Engels. Critique of the 1891 Erfurt program. Marx and Engels used the term dictatorship as it was understood in Roman law, as a magistrate elected by the Roman Senate for a limited period of time to deal with an emergency, and whose rule is disbanded upon its termination. As Norman Levine has argued, it has nothing to do with the later Leninist conception of a prolonged transitional phase led by a political party that monopolizes power. The political transition period discussed by Marx is not a distinct form of society, since it comes between capitalist and socialist or communist society. It is instead a political stage in which the old mode of production is undermined and negated through an ongoing revolutionary process. Once this process is completed, the dictatorship of the proletariat becomes superfluous, since with the abolition of class society and value production, the proletariat is abolished alongside all other classes. What then emerges is the first or initial phase of communism, in which a completely new form of production relations prevails. To be sure, Lenin made a vitally important contribution in his 1917 State and Revolution by returning to Marx's 1875 critique as well as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in order to spell out the need to smash and not simply take over the existing capitalist state. His admonition has hardly been followed by many socialist revolutions since then. However, Lenin muddied the waters considerably in writing, quote, what is usually called socialism was termed by Marx the first or lower phase of communism, end quote. Marx, in fact, makes no such distinction. Socialism and communism for him are interchangeable terms. Moreover, Lenin argued, bourgeois law in regard to the distribution of consumer goods inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state. For law is nothing but an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the rules of law, end quote. Whereas Marx, end quote, Lenin. from State and Revolution. Whereas Marx conceives of the distribution of the social product being achieved through the collective deliberation of the producers, Lenin apparently cannot conceive of how this is possible without the existence of a centralized state. Lenin therefore insists that in the first phase of communist society, all citizens are transformed into hired employees of the state. Lenin therefore insists that, quote, in the first phase of communist society, all citizens are transformed into hired employees of the state, end quote. But Marx nowhere mentions the existence of a state in discussing distribution according to labor time in the lower phase of communism. Nor could he mention it, since the state is based upon the division of society into classes which no longer exists in socialism or communism. Furthermore, Marx does not state, as does Lenin, quote, that all citizens become employees and workers of a single country-wide state syndicate. All that is required is that they should work equally, do their proper share of work, and get equal pay, end quote. This concession, Lenin, State and Revolution, this concession to the existence of wage labor in socialism is nowhere found in Marx's critique. Lenin's interpretation has important consequences, as seen in how it continues to place blinders upon accurately rendering Marx's text to the present day. One recent study contends, quote, we build communist society upon its own foundations by developing new communal relations of production that subordinate the private ownership of labor power by creating a new state, end quote. Michael Leibowitz. Here not only is the state imported to the lower phase of communism, it exists in a higher phase as well. The state is now fetishized to the point of making it an eternal fact of human existence. Tisk tisk. By confusing, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat with the initial phase of the new society, post-Marx Marxists have assumed that the state, which in some form prevails in the political transition period, also continues to dominate in socialism, communism. That this was never Marx's position, however, is clear from his actual writings, which nowhere equate socialism or communism with state domination. For Marx, the state is an excrescence of class society that is superseded in socialism. Footnote. Quote, Maine ignores the much deeper point that the seeming supreme independent existence of the state is itself only seeming, and that it is in all its forms an excrescence of society, just as its appearance itself arises only at a certain stage of social development. It disappears again as soon as society has reached a stage not yet attained. End quote. Marx. End footnote. The closer we explore Marx's body of work with fresh eyes, the more insights we find regarding what constitutes the alternative to capitalism. Here I have only been able to point to a few of the many places where Marx delves directly into this. At the same time, what is no less striking is the enormous distance that separates Marx's view of a post-capitalist society from what has been attributed to him by his critics and many of his followers. An immense layer of conceptual debris heaped upon Marx over the past century has helped to conceal the true nature of his liberatory project. Now that so many alternatives that ruled in its name have exhausted themselves, it is time to return to the source and work out the meaning of his insights for our life and times. To be sure, the fact that Mark said something does not make it true. But isn't it time for us to become clear on what he actually said? In doing so, we may discover that it isn't true because he said it. Rather, it is important that he said it because the realities we have experienced for the past 100 years shows that it is true.